Radu. Today I'm with Johann van Tonder from AWA Digital, and we're gonna share you a lot of insights about practical prioritization over your conversion rate optimization experiments. We a bit of housekeeping. If you have any kind of questions, you can add them via chat. At the end of the session, we're gonna have a Q&A session as well. And mainly, yeah, that's it. Just bear with us for 30 more seconds to be able to share the presentation. Johan, if you want to say something, that's a fine moment.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about prioritization or triage, which I find is one of the elements in CRO that's not covered enough. You know, we talk about process, we talk about ideation, we talk a lot about research, about A/B testing, and there's this missing link, which is prioritization. And it's quite a crucial one, as I hope I'll show today. I think Valentin, will you share the presentation? I'll tell you when to advance. I'm not getting it to work from this side, and
Yeah,
I'll talk to the slides.
yes, sure. Johan is just uploading, and 10 more seconds, and we'll be running. But
Okay, great.
in the meantime, maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself, Johan, how you got into this conversion rate optimization world, and how have you started off from the very beginning?
Yeah, so I've been doing this for 8, 9 years, and I've made all the mistakes that are to be made. I still make a few of them, hopefully only once. I was CEO at an e-commerce company before. I worked in corporate, and while I was in corporate, one of my objectives or my missions was to turn around failing e-commerce businesses or to make them perform better. And that's when I stumbled across CRO. It was the early days. If you bear in mind that Google Analytics only came about in about 2006. So it's only about 10, 11 years old. It hasn't been around that long. Then when we started doing this was right at the beginning. I was a beta user of Crazy Egg, which is now one of the most popular tools. So it's become a lot easier since then, but the fundamental principles are still the same. I think let's get into it, Valentina, if you don't mind. So if you can move on.
Yes, sure.
So I wonder how many of you know the story behind this, which is one of the biggest inventions in e-commerce. I think we'll all agree is this product recommendation engine, and it's a fascinating story behind this, and I'm going to tell it to you quickly. So this, who came up with this idea was a junior software engineer at Amazon, a guy called Greg Linden, and he had this idea of as you added something into your cart, then a related product would pop up. And as you added something new into your cart, another product would pop up. And he thought this had potential. And so he proposed the idea to his organization, Amazon, and his superiors. And the next slide there, you can see that the hippo enters the story because he, to his surprise, it wasn't received the way he thought it would be received. There was one guy in particular at Amazon, the senior VP of marketing at the time, who said, "This is a crazy idea. It's going to disrupt the flow. It's going to cause users to be distracted." Is history. There's the blog post where Greg Linden, this engineer, reflects on this episode, and he says not only did it win, but the feature won by such a wide margin that it not having it live was costing Amazon. And that's interesting because he had to really fight to get that live. He was told in no uncertain terms that you cannot do this, and he went against that. He actually built the prototype. He got it ready after being told not to do it. He built the prototype, got it ready as an A/B test, and by then they couldn't stop him anymore. But management was furious. They really didn't want this to go ahead, and yet this was the outcome. If you can go to the next slide,
Just a second,
coming
Johan,
up with a
because
list of ideas. Yes.
we have a question from the audience. So
Yes.
they are asking if the Amazon-related products were originally CRO gimmick or it was for real.
No, it was for real. There was an algorithm behind this. So Greg Linden, the guy who came up with the idea, he actually built the algorithm. And obviously it was quite early version of this, so very basic, but it made a big impact. It had a huge impact on Amazon. And well, now we all it's like now. Not only is it synonymous with Amazon, but it's become ubiquitous across the web. But this was definitely not just a gimmick; it was real science behind it.
Okay, that's nice to hear. Okay, so we can move on then.
Yeah, so coming up with a list of ideas is the easy part in CRO. So we put a couple of us on this call in a room, give us 30 minutes, and we'll walk away with a long list of ideas. That's not the difficult part. Of course, when you start executing and move on to the next slide, then reality quickly strikes because most A/B tests don't win. This is a stat from usersystem.com. They say that 1 out of 10 tests that they run internally give them a win. You'll find many similar stat line. An often quoted figure is 1 out of 7 tests will give you a win. When they do win, move on to the next slide, then most wins are modest. Experiment Engine, they have thousands of recorded test data in their system. They ran an analysis on this a couple of years ago and found that by far the most wins are in the 0 to 10% bracket. So, we all like to see those double-digit wins, but the truth is they are the exception. And most wins are going to be, far more modest, sub 10%. Next slide. This is something that's really important, and I think at the heart of what we're talking about today. And you've got to think about it in this way, that every test you run is an opportunity cost. Because instead of that test that you're currently running, you could be running another test that may give a chance at a win, that may even give you a better chance at a bigger win. So every time you run a test, there's an inherent opportunity cost. Next slide. So back to this list of ideas, the key question, where do we start? Now, clearly what you don't want to do is you don't want to start with the tests that are going to take months to mature and then not have anything to show for it. That's the quickest way of messing up, not getting buy-in. You want to start ideas that have the best chance of giving you a win, a good win, and then you want to stack it up like that in a roadmap. So you're looking for quicker gains. And this is where triage comes in. So if we go to the next slide.
Just a second, Johan. I just
Yes.
wanted to ask you something. So from your opinion, presume I don't know anything about CRO, and I'm an e-commerce marketer, and I wanna fix the conversion rate. So will I grab the low-hanging fruits so that I can have some wins and gain enough energy and results and showcase this to my boss, or will I go to the most important things and work for, I don't know, 3-4 weeks to implement?
So that's a very good question, and I hope what I'm going to do is just to further answer to that, because I think in the next couple of slides that should become clear. And there's a system that allows you to come closer to that answer. And it's not an easy answer either. It depends on your unique context. But I think, Valentin, let's come back to it a little bit later on. I think it'll become clear in the next couple of slides. So okay. What triage is a predefined set of criteria that everyone has agreed on. And this is important. You've got to have wide agreement on that. And it's a criteria that you can apply consistently throughout the process. If you think back to the story of the Amazon, the product recommendation engine, that was one of the problems there, is that they had no way of objectively evaluating this idea. And it's something that's easily solved with triage. Triage also evolves. So, you start with something, but then you build on it. And I'll talk to that in a moment as well. But it's about far more than ranking. It's not just ranking. And I want to talk about that over the next few slides. So move on. These are ultimately the success drivers of your testing program. So you've got win rate, effect, that's the impact of the test, and then velocity, testing velocity, which is the frequency, the number of tests you run in a given period. Those three things, that's what determines the success of your testing program. Here, I'm not talking about the broad CRO piece, I'm just talking about the A/B testing piece. So if you can increase one or more of these KPIs, then you will increase the success of your testing program. So next slide illustrates that in more detail. And I'm not going to stay here for a long time, but just to explain the thinking behind this. So you've got a before in the middle column and an after, and the after column is just a 30% increase in each of those areas. So instead of running 12 tests, you're running 16 per year. Instead of a 40% win rate, you've got a 52%, and so it goes on. Instead of 10% average uplift, you've got a 13% average uplift. And look at the difference that it makes to the bottom line. It's remarkable. But bear in mind that win rate and effect, those are things that are in a way not directly in your control. Those are things that you don't have such direct control over. Go on, Valentin.
I wanted to ask you something very important, Johan. In this algorithm, there's nothing related to the number of visitors that you're allowed to test from the customer. So how do you treat that? Let's say you wanna run a test on the product page, and your customer is so reluctant that it's not allowing you to test on, I don't know, 50% of the total traffic on the product pages, and it allows you to test only on 10 or 15%. Is this an important issue? How do you treat such problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way to treat it when you have less traffic is to be even more disciplined. So what I mean by that is you've got to give yourself a limited period of time and shoot for a higher uplift. I firmly believe that. So you have two options when you don't have a lot of traffic on your site. The one extreme route is to say, let's run the test for a long time. Let's run it for a month, 6 weeks, maybe even two months. I've seen people run tests for 3 months. I think it's crazy. I think instead what you should do, it's a far better use of your time if you give yourself 2 or 3 weeks max. And again, it depends on the context. It depends on, if you're testing a 30-day guarantee, then 2 weeks is not enough. You need 30 days, obviously. But all things being equal, if you're struggling with traffic volumes, you've got to be far more disciplined. You've got to give yourself a limited period of time to run the test. Aim for a particular threshold, so say 10% or 15%, whatever the lift is you're going for. And if it doesn't deliver the lift after that period, stop it, bank the learning, and move on. Because this is where the opportunity cost comes in. You're using a testing slot, which you can be using to run a test that does give you a win in the end, or that does give you a win within a reasonable period. So I would say you've got to be even more disciplined when you don't have that much traffic. Okay. So back to this slide, the interesting thing here is, as I said, win rate and effect less within your control, but what is in your control is test velocity. In fact, what we've just spoken about, Valentin, the question you asked, talks to that exactly. You can easily increase the number of tests and the rate at which you run those tests. And in fact, next slide, there's a quote from Jeff Bezos at Amazon, who summarizes it well. Our success at Amazon is a function of how many experiments we run. So, it's totally within your control. Then the next slide comes close to the question you've just answered. This is an interesting one where it shows the effect of being more disciplined and the effect of shooting for higher uplift. So the yellow line there, that's sporadic testing, looking for lifts greater than 10%. Then the red line is still looking for lifts greater than 10%, but in a more disciplined fashion. And in the blue line, just look at it, that's when you're looking for lifts greater than 20%. Now, 20% sounds like a big number, especially in the context of what I've just mentioned earlier, that most wins will be far more modest than that. But this is the principle behind it. And if you go to the next slide, triage covers that as well. So triage fundamentally is about ROI, return on investment. And return on investment, as we all know, is the ratio between the cost of doing something versus the expected return of that something. So it's cost versus return. And in the case of CRO, that comes down to complexity versus impact. So next slide starts unpacking that a little bit more. So here you've got two, and this is the way you should be thinking about all the ideas that you have on your list, what I'm showing you now. So you've got essentially two axes. So you've got the complexity axis and you've got the return axis. And then you've got these four potential quadrants, different strategies. So the no-brainer is the next slide, is the one top left. These are your quick gains that you spoke about earlier, Valentin. And so they're low effort, but high impact. And of course, you should go after them. You should chase them and you should knock them down immediately. You want to start with those. But the problem is there are only a few of those usually, and you quickly deplete them. So, there's always going to be only so much low-hanging fruit. The next one's also interesting, and it's also a no-brainer, and that's bottom right, which is high cost but low return. Why would you want to bother with that? If it's going to cost you a lot or the complexity is a lot, but you're not going to be able to get the return to show for it, then clearly what you should do is dump them. Don't carry on with them. Maybe you can evolve them into something, but as they are. And this is the problem with just randomly picking ideas from a list. What's called RATs, random acts of testing, is that if you haven't applied your mind in this matrix, then you might very well be picking things from this quadrant, and that's not what you want to be doing. So the next slide, this is where it becomes interesting, because this is where something is low complexity, but also low return. And there's a debate about this in the industry, because some people would say, well, if it's low cost and low complexity, then, let's do it, because it's not going to cost as much. It's not going to take much effort. Well, there's always the opportunity cost, which I've already spoken about. So my view there is, unless you've got a learning upside, in other words, unless you can distill some insight from that test that can be amplified across the entire program, then this is an area you want to avoid altogether. So then the last slide, this is also an interesting one. This is where most of your tests, most of your ideas will sit in this column. So it's a high complexity, but also high potential return. And there were two important things that I want to say about this. The first one is, as I say there, minimum viable test. I'm a great proponent of minimum viable test. And what I mean is, how can you, remember, this is a high complexity test. And remember also, this is going to be most of the tests in your program. The question is, how can you dial down the complexity without losing the ability to validate that hypothesis? So I'll give you an example that I saw just recently, actually. A test where we decided to drop the responsive requirement. That shaved off a day's development work, and actually it wasn't necessary to prove or to validate the hypothesis. I often see optimizers obsessing about minutia of CSS and little tiny UI adjustments. And my question to them is, does it really make a difference? Is this getting in the way of validating the hypothesis? If it does get in the way of validating the hypothesis, then absolutely you should sweat about it. But if it's not, then you should be dialing down that complexity. So that's the first thing, is aiming for minimum viable test. The other thing that's interesting, and I don't see a lot of people in the industry doing this, is pilot studies. And what a pilot study is before you run your A/B test, you run a different kind of analysis on that idea. So maybe it's a usability test, or it's a survey. So let me give you an example. If you have an A/B test idea, before you get the A/B test, you can put some lo-fi wireframes in something like InVision, and then do user testing on it. And the benefit of that is it helps you to validate the hypothesis, but it can even help you to fine-tune it. And it can help you to uncover some potential usability issues that might have got in the way of you validating that hypothesis. You're not going to do this every time, but you're going to do it when you're faced with a severely complex test. And remember, this is about how can you move it to a minimum viable test. I'll mention one quick example of where a famous company used this, so Spotify, we all know. And in 2014, they experimented with dark blue UI versus light blue UI. And before they ran the test, they actually ran a survey covering 1,500 people, where they gathered attitude data about the difference between the two. So they had far more insights before they finally went into the test. And it's a way to see whether the test is worth running. You might even re-rank the test once you've done that pilot study. So that's something to bear in mind.
Johan, just
The
a
next,
second.
yeah.
We have a question from Henrik. He wants to find a little bit more about how can you accurately assess both impact and cost. So
Great time to be asking the question. Great time to be asking the question, because we're getting into the more practical frameworks now. So Henrik, if you just bear with me for a couple of minutes, I think this question will be answered over the next few slides. So if you move on, Valentin, to the next slide. This is the PI framework, and it's probably the most famous triage framework. Chris Goward developed it, and there were these three areas, and you assess each idea in each of these three areas. So potential, this is what Henrik is talking about. The potential is how much improvement can be made in this area of sites. And the question is, how do we determine that? We'll see that in a moment. Importance is how valuable is the traffic in this area of the site we will be testing. And then ease is how complicated will the test be to implement. So let's look at it in a little bit more detail. So next slide. What you'll do with Pi is you assign a score out of 10 for each of those areas, for each idea, and then you divide that total by 3. And that's when you get your Pi score. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But there's often confusion between potential and importance. So I just want to go through that in a little bit more detail. So next slide. P, potential, we look at that first. This is really, the potential is really your evidentiary basis. So here you're looking at all the evidence that you have pointing to a particular idea. So, you know, in analytics, for example, you might look at things like page value, exit and bounce rates, journey mapping. So let's talk through a quick example, Henrik, for your benefit maybe. Is imagine you've done journey mapping, and I'm talking about a pure e-commerce site now, and let's say on the PDP, on the product detail page, you've found a situation where you've got a massive drop-off. So you've got, let's say, 98% drop-off between product page and basket page. On top of that, you've done some qualitative research, maybe some user testing, and let's say you found that there's a size concern. So it's a fashion site, you're selling shirts and that kind of stuff, and people are concerned about whether this will fit me. Quite a common concern on a fashion site. And then maybe you've got some other data that points in the same direction. So maybe you see from heat maps that people click a lot on the size guide, and everything points to that being a big theme. So this would be an indicator that size, or the anxiety around size on the PDP, is an area of big potential. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about importance. Importance really is about the reach of your traffic. Remember, the question there is, how valuable is this traffic in this area of the site? So it's about traffic volume, what Valentin spoke about earlier. Clearly, the less traffic you have, the more difficult it becomes to run a test. So that is important, but also the traffic cost. So if it's an area of the site where a large portion of the traffic is, say, PPC or other ads, then if you improve the conversion of that traffic in that area of the site, then what you're going to do is you're going to make your acquisition dollar stretch a lot further. So move on to the next slide. And this is about ease, and Goward makes a distinction here between technical ease and political ease. So some examples with technical ease, what is the level of CSS and JavaScript? Are there any backend changes? Are there any advanced triggering conditions? What about the reusability of your code, dependencies, restrictions? Also, in terms of human resources, do you need a developer to come in, a designer to come in, a copywriter? That increases complexity. Political ease should not be underestimated. And in fact, again, the story that I started with is a great example of political ease being a factor. Greg Linden had to really fight hard to get that test out. And mostly it won't go that far. Often we found, for example, homepages is a very sensitive area. So people, they see it as the window into the site. Everyone in the organization will look at the homepage every day, so it's very visible. And it's usually where the tone of the brand is reflected. And there might be some resistance internally, at least with some people, to run a test on the homepage. So that's one example of political ease. And then the next slide shows you how this all is. So that's the same list that I showed you before, but now you've got the additional columns. So you've got one each for potential, important, and ease. And then you add all of them together, you divide it by 3, and you get the pi score at the end. So in this case, the third line is the highest pi score. So that would be your idea that you would start with immediately. It's also worth saying that often when I look at optimizers' pi scores, I find that they all cluster, or a lot of them cluster around the same area. So in this case, I think you've got 3 or 4 different 7s, and you've got 3 or 4 different 0.7s. I would usually challenge an optimizer at this point to apply their mind and to reevaluate those. It might be that you end up with the same number, but just to be really strict and disciplined about how even a difference between those two can ultimately make a big difference. So it's a good exercise to go through and to really force yourself to find a distinction. So the next framework on the next slide, also a relatively famous one. This is the TIR framework by Brian Eisenberg. There are similarities. He asked the following 3 questions. So time, how long will it take to execute? Now, this is everything from the conceptualization to the hypothesis development, to the wireframing, to the test build, to the test duration, all of that. How long will it take? The importance, by how much can we increase revenue or reduce costs? He's quite clear about that.
Johan, can you hear us? We can't hear you at this moment. We are having a bit of technical difficulties. Just a second to try to add Johan again into the room. Okay, so Johan is gonna re-enter in the room. Just bear with us for a few more seconds. If you have any other questions regarding TIR or the framework, just let us know, because Johan is gonna be back. I think his connection dropped and he's gonna re-enter the room. Okay, so as Johan is gonna restart his computer, I need to entertain you somehow. So let me ask you a few questions. How many of you are actually using any kind of prioritization on your A/B testing efforts? Can you let us know on the chat box? So I tried to get in touch with Johan, but he's not available. Hopefully he's fine, and it's just an internet service provider problem. So I think till he will get back, let me show you a thing that we're gonna give you. So if you are here doing conversion rate optimization for e-commerce websites, we have this free research for you that we prepared that, based on our experience. Okay, so Johan is back, and we're gonna talk a bit about that after I'll make him a presenter again. Okay, Johan, can you hear us? Johan, can you hear us now?
Yes, I was on mute there. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can all hear you, Johan. Welcome back.
Yes. Sorry about that. I dropped out and I had to go through the whole thing again to back in.
Okay, no worries.
Do it so you assign a score out of 5 for each of those areas. And in this case, you multiply it and you don't divide it. So you end up with a maximum score of 125. And then you risk you rank your ideas based on that score. But now I want to talk about something really interesting, and this is moving on to the next slide. So the concept of maybe developing your own triage framework, because here's an interesting thought. The the story we spoke about at the beginning of this call, Greg Linden's idea of having the product recommendation engine, would that have survived the PI framework? If you think about it, it's got weak evidentiary basis. It's an employee suggestion. It's politically as complex as it can get. You've got a hippo that really doesn't want you to do this. And it's not technically easy because you have to build algorithms. So, potentially on a PI framework, that could have ranked quite low and may never have seen the time of day. So in this case, you might want to consider building something or finding a framework that's more suited to your needs. So you move on to the next slide. Some of the things that you may want to consider when you think about this in your organization. We've already spoken about the things on the left: impact, importance, complexity. And those are the things that all the major frameworks, I've shown you two today, but the main ones will all cover them. But on the right are things that you may want to consider that are specific to your business, your own objectives. Maybe you've got objectives, business objectives that steer you in a particular direction. We'll look at that in a moment. Maybe the softer side is more important for your business than the hard numbers, and perhaps you want to emphasize the learning. In fact, we've worked with clients where they've said to us that we're not as concerned about the lift. We want to see that, we want to see the wins. We're more interested in learning from these tests. We want to build our knowledge base of our customers and the way our customers interact with our site. And that's far more important because over the long period of time, that's going to be, we're going to be able to amplify that across the entire business. So if you move to the next slide, here's the third and final system I want to share with you today. This is a far more flexible one, very granular. And just let me explain to you the highlights quickly. So on the left, you've got for each, and this is just an Excel spreadsheet you could use, for each area of importance in your business, you can have a line for each of that. So in this case, they've added, can we test RPV as a primary metric? That's clearly very important in this business. Velocity, so they take that quite seriously about running the maximum number of tests. Line 2, their high attrition area. This is a signal for them of a test with high potential. So for every context, and for you, it would be thinking through what are those important things in your business that will go on the left there. And then the columns right next to it, you add a point if it satisfies that condition, and you subtract a point on the right if it doesn't satisfy the condition. So let's look at a few of them. So you've got the minimum effect, the bottom two lines. If it's a test that potentially will get more than 10%, we'll get 1 point. If it doesn't, we minus 1 point. If it's only the last line, technical ease, if it's only basic HTML and CSS and JavaScript, then it'll get 1 point. If there are backend changes involved, or advanced triggering, targeting, or there's additional design involved, then you'll subtract a point. And so you might even want to use a hybrid. So what I mean by that is, and I've done this myself before, where we use something like the Pi framework to do the initial scoring and to give you an initial overview of how the ideas stack up. But then you apply, let's say you take the top 20 ideas and you apply something more granular like this, and you can really start to see how they where the distinctions are, and you start seeing two ideas that both had a 7 score on Pi, suddenly they stack up very differently. So it's a good way of doing it. This was made famous by Hotwire, and it's probably my favorite technique. And it's a little bit more effort, but then this is an area in the process where you absolutely do want to invest in that effort. And then the next slide. This is getting to the end of the presentation, and now it's your turn. And I want to leave you with the following messages. Firstly, have a system, any system. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be any of the systems we spoke about today. In fact, even if it's just one question or 2 questions that forces you to apply your mind, and it can be as basic as thinking about cost versus benefit. But you've got to have something. You've got to have a way of ranking those ideas and bubbling up the most important ones. And the fundamental thing that you're looking for is ROI. So it's about that cost versus return. You've got to align it with your own specific context. And this is a very important point. Don't obsess about the list, that list of ideas. You're going to be wrong anyway, right? As the test results start coming in, you're going to see that you're going to take a different view on some of the things that remain on the roadmap, and that's fine. That's always going to be the case. What you've got to focus on is the process of triage and how you identify those winners. And I don't know, Valentin, if you've already shown the next one. I know you started moving towards the end. So then the next one is just, this is a book I co-wrote recently. All of this stuff that I spoke about in this webinar and a lot more is in this. It's a practical how-to guide for e-commerce optimization. And for exclusively for the people on this call, is a 20% discount if you order it straight from the publisher's website Kogan page. So it's bit.ly/ecombook, and then there's your discount code. And yeah, if you want to make use of that. And thanks very much for joining. And I hope there was something that was useful. And Valentina, we're going to take some questions.
Yeah. If you have any kind of questions, guys, that's a good moment to ask them. Johan, in the meantime, I have a few questions for you, which I've already prepared. The first one is, what is the experiment that makes you proud mostly out of all your career?
It's usually the ones if you talk about complexity, it often is the ones that are super complex. And I guess the reason they make me proud is because that effort paid off. So that's the one the one way I look at it. But the other aspect or theme that gives me great satisfaction is when I run a test that's negative initially, and then you build on that. So you draw the insight from that negative test and you build on it, and you run a follow-on test and you get an uplift. That's always a great satisfaction. And if I think of one recently, quite a famous footwear retailer, big brand, and I mentioned the example earlier of the size anxiety, and this was in fact the thing that I was treating. And we treated the size anxiety on the product detail page, and then we found a drop in revenue from that test. And when I analyzed it, I realized, but actually we were treating it too well, and it was too dominant in the eye path. And what that meant was that people who didn't have the concern of size previously were now primed by that treatment of ours. And so we demoted it just slightly, and that gave us a good uplift in revenue. Exactly the same execution, well, exactly the same design, but just executed slightly differently, demoting it and learning from that first test. That gives me great satisfaction.
Yeah, that sounds like a very good experience. Another question that we have is, when do you decide a test is ready? So you've said that in the first 2-3 weeks that test wasn't performing well, and you've decided to modify it. So mainly after you launch a test, you have three options: either you stop it, either you adjust it, or either you declare it as a winner and implement it. So when do you decide to modify a test or to stop it?
Is the question when do I decide to stop a test, or is the question when do I decide to adjust a test?
To adjust it or to stop it. So what kind of triggers do you use to say, okay, this is a failed test, let's forget about it, or let's adjust it because it still has value?
Yeah. So firstly, I never see a test as a failed test. Well, it's a failed test if it's set up in such a way that you can't learn anything from it. And I've made that mistake. And it's not a good place to be. But if you set up your test in such a way that that you can always learn from it. And in fact, Valentin, that's probably a great topic for a webinar, because that's such an important skill to have in CRO. Then you will never have a failed test. You will always learn something from it, and you'll always be able to build on it, and you'll always be able to advance from that negative. But when it comes to stopping tests, there's an over-reliance in the industry on this 95% statistical significance. And I think, the one area that CRO practitioners absolutely need to skill up in is to get a grounding. If you don't come from a stats background, is to get that grounding in stats, to really understand what these things mean, to understand variance, understand power, and understand that statistical significance actually, and 95%, and what that means, and why that's not a signal to pause a test or to stop a test. The rules that I apply tend to be what I shared with you earlier. I try to follow the 2-week rule. And again, this is all things being equal, because there are some cases where you need to run a test for longer, not because you don't have data, but because because the model, the business model, or the way in which the traffic returns to the site, there might be a big lag. So for example, if you work with an e-commerce site where 60-70% of the purchases are made over a long period of time, then running a test for 2 weeks, you're going to exclude that. So I would stick to the 2-week rule mainly, and after 2 weeks, call it. Look at the numbers that are there. If I don't have a win, I don't have a win. I'm not going to run it for another week to see if a win will brew. It's at that point where you draw insight from it. You look at the analysis. So the way I do this is you have a primary metric. You only call the test by that primary metric. I usually try, when it's an e-commerce business, I try to get as close to revenue as possible. So ideally RPV, revenue per visitor. Sometimes you can't do that for various reasons, but then as close to that revenue number as possible. But then in addition to that primary metric, you'll have a range of secondary metrics. And that's really important. Now, firstly, you will never call the test by a secondary metric. That's not the purpose of a secondary metric, and you should be very disciplined about this. But where it is very handy is it allows you to understand the story. So to put the primary performance in context. So you will look at how those secondary metrics perform, and that, you ask questions, you really delve into it, you ask, why did I get a win? Why did I not get a win? Why is it inconclusive? And then look at your secondary metrics and ask the same question, and then start thinking about what's possibly behind that, because that exercise is what will give you the insight that I spoke about earlier that will allow you to move forward. So I spend a lot of time doing post-test analysis. I probably spend at least as much time, but possibly more time, doing post-test analysis than actually briefing and wireframing the test. Because now you've got data, you can analyze it. That's hard data that you can work with. That you can, if you look into the numbers, things will jump out at you. So that's really important for me.
Okay, that makes total sense, Johan. I have my last question is something related to education. So, if you would be asked, what is the book that you've read which had the biggest impact on your life as an optimizer, what that book would be?
Wow, that's 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 not an easy question. I'm an avid reader. The best investment I made when I did my MBA a couple of years ago, before I did it, did a course in speed reading, and I can highly recommend it. So I'm a speed reader. I can read a book in a night and have full grasp of it. And I read it. I read a lot. I read a book a day. So it's difficult to pick one. I would say the books that had the biggest impact on me probably had not much to do with CRO, but more business in general. So the lean startup, CRO, it's part of that movement. So it's important to understand that the lean methodology, build, measure, learn, we fit into that beautifully. There's another book, the Profit Center, I think it's called, which is more a business book, but it's about how where profit, um, where it happens in a business, where it's released in a business. And for a CRO, especially like me, I specialize in e-commerce. This is stuff you need to understand. It's not about moving things around on a page to improve usability. No, no. It's about improving revenue and ultimately profit of your client and of the site that you're working with. So you've got to have a grip on this stuff. You've got to understand what is profit and where is it released? How does it happen in the business? So I'm fascinated by that. And then also I think the one classic that I'm sure we've all read, and if you haven't, then I would urge you to is Cialdini's Influence,
Yeah.
which is something I reread from time to time.
Okay. Uh, great webinar. Thanks a lot, Johan, for your time and your insights. If you want to find out Johan, you can hunt him for on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Guys, that was it. That's a wrap for today's presentation. Have a great life ahead, and make sure you are always converting it to a better life. All the best. Bye bye, Johan.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye, everyone.